to our inquiry into the implementation of universal credit. I think our inquiry seems to be quite timely, as it seems to have generated rather a lot of interest. Can I begin with an apology on behalf of the committee as to why our numbers seem a bit denuded, but it would appear that this committee is a very good recruiting ground into ministerial office, or indeed PPS office. So unfortunately 4 of our government members have departed, and from the Labour side we have one member who's recently just lost her mother and another who's been in hospital with an operation. So apologies for the numbers, but no doubt we still have just as many questions, and we've got rather a lot of questions. So without further ado, if I can start by asking some questions on the whole issue of payment arrangements and the support for claimants. Now, the target is that by 2013, which isn't that long away, 50% of claims will be made online. Do you think this is achievable, bearing in mind that less than 20% of GSA claims are currently made online?
Yes, Chairman, can I say it's always a privilege to be here. I'm very happy to be here, and of course the two of us together we hope we'll be able to cover all of your questions between us, and the full range of them, including some of the points we made earlier on about the issues around RTI as well, and I think we should be able to cope with those quite happily. Yes, I do, actually, because our position was that by 2013, 50% online. But it's quite interesting, the facts about how society has moved on a lot from sometimes where my colleagues think they are. In reality, they're quite different. 83% of UK households have internet access. We're above the EU average. And what's interesting, really, is when we surveyed claimants, we found that 78% of all claimants, by the way, this includes the tax credits, etc., use the internet, and these 41% actually carry on online banking. So people who are actually in receipt of benefits are also a very significant chunk of them, not just being online, the majority, but also significantly online banking. So we do, and we broke them up. I had a long look at this with the officials and with David, and we looked at this and we broke them down really into 3 groups to see how we therefore make sure, recognising that originally when we started 20% were doing is actually 30% were making an attempt at online, not completing the online processes. So there's a higher number that actually start by going online but found the present system too complex. And so essentially we broke them down into 3 groups. The group that are willing and able, and that's about 30%, who frankly won't take any time to move them across with a better system, and that's what the whole of UC is meant to be about. The other group, which is 33%, are willing but will require some support because they're already literate and they just need to be got across onto this in terms of benefits. And the last group, about up to 37%, who aren't really used to this at all. Some of them aren't literate, some are but have never thought about it and are resistant to it, and those will require the greater level of support, and that's how we work it.
Can we actually look then at that last group you've just described,
yeah, sure,
who, with the best will in the world, will never have access to the internet, either at home or indeed, if they don't have it at home, they're unlikely to be able to access it in a public place either. So what help is going to be in place for them? Will there be a helpline number they can phone automatically?
Well, there are 2 things. But first of all, I don't, with respect, I don't accept that they won't be. I think part of the process of this is that many of those in that group will already have access, be using telephones, using processes that involve them actually being online. The point that we're making here is that for some other reason, it may be for some of them that they're not online, but for others that are online but very resistant to the idea of having to do this, they're used to going into the benefit centres, they're used to be doing it by telephone. So they're the ones that are resistant. Now, there are plenty of things that we're doing to break them down. The first is to break those groups down into those who actually have some understanding of the internet. And what we're going to be doing is putting inside, and we are at the moment trialling that, but we will be putting inside the job centres a much greater number of computers, computers that are wired through to the claim process. We will make sure that individuals...
And will there be people there to actually help?
Yes, the whole point is that in the job centres, people will be trained up to help them. I also want to put alongside those telephones so that they can go through to the existing telephone system, the telephone banks that we have, and they'll be processed so that they will actually be helped through. So in other words, they're online, they're not sure about it, they pick up the telephone and they talk to somebody at the other end and they say, okay, right, let's get you onto the right page, let's get you down, you need to fill in that box, have you done it? And in due course, we want to be able to tie them up so what they see and what the claimant sees is exactly the same page, so they can walk them through, make sure their claim is exactly correct, so they get used to it. Remember, they'll only ever have to make one claim and thereafter it's just a check and adjust thereafter. They won't have to keep on making the same claim again. Second bit of it is, for those that are capable of going home and doing it because they have internet access, some training on this will release them to do it from home. For those who really aren't, then we'll keep them coming in. And we're also looking for those outlying areas, mobile support and access. And we've been talking to the telephone company about this. They have mobile vans and systems, and we want to be able to use those as well for the people who find themselves in vulnerable situations. Am I mistaken?
I think it's worthwhile explaining what we mean by digital by default, which is if you go on with separate channels, telephone channel, a face-to-face channel, and a digital channel, what inevitably happens is that people go on one of them and stay on the one that they've chosen. So what we're aiming to do is converge people onto the digital channel.
So you basically want to force them on digital, and you put up quite a lot of barriers to make sure they go onto the digital.
No, that's not exactly not what I said.
No.
I said the digital channel is the main channel, but what you're doing with, for instance, a face-to-face channel, which we're looking at how best to do, you will be supporting people with a face-to-face meeting, getting them onto digital. So it may be that the first time they need face-to-face support getting on digital, the second time, the third time, but eventually those people will be able to handle their own claim themselves directly with the system. And one of the things we're doing is trialling on a rather elaborate basis, piloting with the local authorities how to provide some of these services, particularly how to get people onto digital, how to get people financially included, because that's the other area of concern that we have, that we actually get people financially and digitally included so they can take the full part in the economic life of this country.
It is important, of course, and I'll finish this because I know you want to move on various other questions, but the really important point is to see this as a real positive opportunity. Actually, quite a lot of the people that end up in difficulties who are not almost immediately in the world of work, one of the big problems we've found to a lot of the work that we've done is they're excluded from quite a lot of jobs that these days require some kind of computer literacy. And so they are ruled out of those. So they're very limited in what they can do. This is a very good opportunity to get those people back into basically the 21st century so they're able to take some of those jobs, and many of those jobs are being found by people coming from outside. So it's really, really a good opportunity to get them online. It'll give them the world a good.
Okay, Andrew.
So really, the fact that they'll be using the digital access to this and they'll have somebody by the side helping them through it, it's actually almost like a training to prepare them better for work as well.
It is for those that need it.
Yeah.
But as I said, at the moment we treat everybody as though they have absolutely no skill in this at all.
Right.
So they by default, they either come into the centres or they do it by telephone and somebody else does a lot of it for them. So my point is an awful lot of those people actually would be quite content to do this if we just get them on the right track. And for those that actually, even those who haven't got devices, we're working with companies to get those small internet access devices, which are sort of dumb terminals that they can use as well if they want those installed at the first time in their home. So we're looking at all of those aspects to help people get through. And so to get 50% in October, actually, I don't think is an issue at all, and 80% by the end of this, I think we'll be exceeding that.
Can I just be clear, because you said about small will people be able to access this on their smartphones? Because large numbers of those who are being classed as the digitally active that you've already classed have only got access not through major computers but through their smartphones. Because there's obviously security issues around that.
I mean, what you've got to look at, this system is being gradually introduced over 4 years, and it's on a digital platform. Now, right now, the favoured digital platforms may be laptops or computers. But as you look forward, you can see that it can be on anything. It could be on a phone. Google is experimenting with putting it on glasses. I mean, the fact is that the revolution.
I think sunglasses will be what you can read on the screen. It's not
but what I'm saying is we are preparing a system that is capable of expanding through the decades of the rest of the technological development.
Can I ask then, how much resources, have you quantified the resources that we put in place to make sure that with the terminals in Job Centre Plus, there is that help? is that anywhere? Can we get copies of how much that's all going to cost, especially as the numbers of staff in Jobs Centre Plus have been getting cut over recent years?
Yeah, well, actually, I'm quite happy to talk to you and, if necessary, submit whatever it is to the committee. But my general view about this, and I've been very close to this from the word go, is I don't, right now, I think it'll be far more effective and more efficient. So rather than costing us any great money, in truth, it's actually going to save us an awful lot of money.
I mean, that's in the long term, but
even in the medium term, to be quite frank.
You're not going to have.
But I'm very happy, Chairman, to submit to you anything you want about what
there's anything,
yeah.
I think would be really. But
it's an investment.
Yeah.
Whatever we do here is an investment in changing people's lives and getting them in a situation where they're able to have a much improved quality of life, and also, more accessible to jobs, quicker to get their things sorted out, much quicker to find out their situation.
Even talking about the numbers that you have, I'll come to you in a second, Linda. Even talking about the numbers you have, they're still talking about huge numbers, even by the end of rollout, 20% who will not be able to do the digital online form. How will you identify those people? What will be the criteria that will alert your department, here is someone who's going to need extra help and who's not going to be able to access it through digital online?
I mean, this is the one of the key issues that we are looking at dealing with. We are currently working out to deal with, because the current system has basically got something that falls to the lowest common denominator, as Ian said. And what we are determined to do is to find the people who really need the support and provide that support for them, without encouraging everyone to require that level of support, so that and then we tend to move people up. Now we're doing a major exercise currently to work out how to find those people and find out what support they need. And what we're finding is that it's wrong to look at people as being vulnerable as a group. What is right to do is to look at them having particular vulnerabilities, and then how do we support them with those vulnerabilities?
So what are those vulnerabilities then?
Well, there's various things. Incapable of using digital media, incapable of running a budget. These are various difficulties which may be medical or disabilities. So those are particular vulnerabilities which will need particular support.
And for them, we'll be providing, the exceptions are to provide a face-to-face channel for people that we find in that situation who will be actually helped to walk through this process and supported all the way through. So we've always allowed for the fact that we provide this for the majority, and the minority that have difficulty, we actually provide support.
So for the people at the moment who have needed a welfare rights officer, or they've needed help in filling in the form, will the proxy be able to access their online, or will there be all sorts of barriers that would stop other people? There must be in terms of
no, we will have a system that allows trusted intermediaries to enter on behalf of those people and to help them do those things. I mean, some people, we have a trusted intermediary system here, and that system will run on.
Bear in mind, we do quite a lot of this.
Sorry, a trusted intermediary doesn't usually apply to welfare rights officers, because someone will go into the office and it'll be a different officer or CAB staff. A trusted intermediary is a relative, but there will be people who don't have relatives or other people in their family circle that can help them.
But we do an awful lot of this work already. I mean, there's nothing new about this for the job centres. So there's a whole variety of ways, as I said earlier on, but that's exactly my point. Is that those same people, that if they're in that kind of state, will at the moment be dealt with closely and personally by members of staff. They'll also be dealt with sensitively if they're on the telephone. I mean, there's a whole process the job centre already does that too. What we're simply saying is that the system itself, the present system, is not good for going online because it's very messy, it's very notchy, and it's very difficult to negotiate. The new system we're designing, which I think you had a bit of a presentation on, is going to be much simpler, much easier, and tug them down in a very straightforward way. So what we're basically saying is, for the majority, and for those vast majority who are on or will be online, that system will help them get through, and there'll be some support. For those who are left behind, absolutely, they may be temporary, they may be permanently, we will make sure they're all
through. And that's all assuming that the computer system works, but I wasn't going to go into that, but
well, thank you.
Desperate to get in.
Yes, the first part is to Lord Freud. Are you saying that you're regarding local authorities as playing a major role in this programme? And if they are they being funded adequately? Is the equipment going to be provided to them? Will they be encouraged to employ and train increased staff? And on the issue of the most vulnerable, the Secretary of State led me to believe that you already know what constitutes the most vulnerable. Do you? I mean, do you know who they are, where they are, what their vulnerabilities are? For example, it's merely anecdotal, but one of my constituents who suffers from agoraphobia and has never left his house for 35 years, everything for him to date has been done by his mother, who is clearly ageing every year and has disabilities herself and is a million miles from being able to use a computer in any way, shape or form. How are his needs going to be met? And to pick up on the point that the Chair made, who is the trusted individual? And what kind of security systems are you going to put in place to ensure that the individual is trustworthy?
Let's start off with the first set of questions, which is about the local authorities. Yeah. We have just last month announced a series of pilots on how local authorities can work with universal credit. So we have them in 15 plus local authorities where they are working on how do you get people digitally on the digital system, how do you get the financial support, how do you help them into work and other aspects, how do you help them. And I was deeply impressed by we had exactly 38 proposals for these pilots from local authorities. And I was deeply impressed by the imagination and the focus of those pilots when you started to read them through, how they were really concentrating on helping people as individuals in a way that I had never seen before. And I actually think it's one of the best things coming out of universal credit is the way that you're getting a focus on the people's complete issues and the way that they're addressed. So I'm very encouraged by those pilots. They're just starting. Effectively, there was a meeting today where they were all assembled to look at how to do it. They will take place over the next year. We will learn a lot of lessons from those pilots on how exactly local authorities should be involved. And then as we move through the process over the next 4 years, from October 13 to 17, and we start to get the more people with greater difficulties, we will be able to, we will have learned those lessons and learned how best local authorities, among others, should be deployed.
And will the funding be there to assist local authorities?
Well, clearly it's premature to say exactly what kind of funding is required.
Well, we know the cuts they're having to carry.
But, you know, we will be, we have got funds to introduce the universal credit. We are not concerned about who undertakes particular endeavours, and we can pay that on a neutral basis. So in that sense, yes, we do have funding for it.
My understanding was that the 2 or 3 billion, there seemed to be some argument in the debate last Tuesday, that was set aside to help introduce universal credit, that a large chunk of that would go in the transitional protection for those whose income would lose out, rather than actually in the mechanics of it.
Well, the mechanics are part of all of that money. I mean, the whole point that we were talking about is getting people online. All those sort of processes are part of what we have to do. We are discussing with local government about how that lies and where that sits. There are other organisations we're talking to, charitable organisations. Can I just pick up one point?
Can I just pursue that, because I'm not clear, because my understanding that the bulk of the 2 or the 3 billion, the cost, a large proportion of that, but never heard what the proportion would be, would actually be straightforward cash transfer to claimants to make up for the difference between what they were getting before universal credit was introduced and what they're getting after universal credit. Now that will eventually disappear as inflation takes over. So that therefore leaves a lot less money in terms of the implementation to go to local authorities, to go to...
With respect, less and more are just terms. The reality for us is that we have to sit down, which is what we're doing with local government, identify what they think they can do, where the overlaps are with things that they're already doing. For example, we're also localising the social fund, an area that will overlap with some of these vulnerable groups. They have to spot that.
Anymore.
So we're working in the details there. So my point is simply it's a matter of process for us with them is to decide how this is done, where this is done, and who does it, and what the breakout on that is. So I wouldn't really get caught up in the issues around the detailed funding at this particular point, because within the envelopes of all of funding we will find the responsibilities for this. I don't think there's an issue here.
But surely that amount is capped. You can't...
Yeah, but I'm not asking. With respect, Chairman, I'm not, and I don't think we should get into a debate about whether or not there's a finite amount within this. My point is we are obligated with local government and with all the other organisations. We planned for this originally. This is what we're discussing and talking to them about, where these responsibilities lie and to what extent some of those may be picked up already and others that we may have to add to as necessary. Can I pick up the point that Glenda Jackson said on this point? Because Glenda Jackson gave a particular case. Can I say actually that case would have to be resolved right now as it stood, because if you've got an ageing mother and the ageing mother is less likely in the future to be able to help them out, then that is exactly what they already have to do, is to find out how they will be able to deal with this individual who has that particular condition. That isn't going to change for universal credit. In fact, what universal credit will do will allow us to focus in rather quickly on those sort of people who have those problems, rather than letting them or making them come to us. We'll be able to discover them much quicker than we do at the moment, for the very simple reason is how we break this down. It all comes into one single figure. So instead of saying
you know who these vulnerable people
we
are.
do. We know them already. My point is you're giving us a case that exists already. That is already known. That will be passported across. My point is, for other new groups that have these particular problems, this process will allow us to get to them much quicker than we do at the present.
And who will be the trusted individual, and how will that trust be defined?
Well, that's between the individual themselves as it requires this, the people that they trust, and the department and the job centres, and all those people will be together, as in all these cases, working out how we support that individual. You know, actually one of the things about this, including things like monthly payments we want to come on to and others, is that actually we can start hubbing up around the individual rather than treating them on a single item at each point. We actually begin to understand those who have vulnerabilities, who don't make it to the points that we need. Now we can really identify those, and instead of having a system set around them, have a system set for the majority that allows us to deal with those who have particular individual problems.
But who's going to be responsible for this interweaving of all the departments? Well, if I simply look at some of the most vulnerable people in my constituency, it's not only Job Centre Plus, it's the health service, it's local authorities, it could be mental health.
With respect, Mr Jackson, there's nothing going to change in that, because these are the same organisations that deal with them daily and get on with trying to resolve what it is for them that we need to do. The point about universal credit means, I think and believe, that we will be able to identify them in a far faster mode, in a more meaningful way, because we will be able to surround them with a relevant... So let me just take an example. Somebody that has a problem with budgeting, we'll get to them much quicker.
I think we've got the vulnerable people already exist in the system, and we deal with them in the present system.
But we don't.
Obviously, whether we do or not is the argument. Can I just, on terms of how much the universal credit or any major reform to the welfare system costs a lot of money, both administratively and in terms of transitional protection. The local authorities are very worried that they're going to be given a great deal more work to do, but on a diminished budget. That's made even worse by the fact that council tax benefit will be devolved to local authorities as well, with a 10% top slice, but they're not allowed to affect pensioners. So what assurances can you give to the local authorities that they're not going to suddenly be landed with a huge amount of extra work supporting the vulnerable people that they are helping people, but there won't be the money there. The trickle down is not going to happen from the money that's there to implement this system.
I mean, we will. I mean, you know, we will bluntly abide by the new burdens doctrine. So we will, to the extent that there are genuine new burdens, we will, which we have transferred from our responsibility. The costs will have to go there, albeit costs that are reasonable and are judged to be reasonable. So there is a big process there, and there is clearly quite a change in the localization of some of the responsibilities that the welfare system would have centralised.
But that flies in the face. The localisation of the responsibility flies in the, you know, I think I've said to the Secretary of State before that the Secretary of State for Communities, his localism trumped the Secretary of State's simplicity.
No. I mean, let me just go through that. What we are effectively transferring to local authorities is a whole range of responsibilities where they can make better judgments on their local requirements. So elements of the social fund, the decisions on DHPs, which are very substantial. Next year, DHPs are, when you add them all up, are 165 million. Decisions on direct payments, decisions...
But that just confuses the landscape. The whole point of universal credit, the reason that you get people like me saying in principle this is a good idea, was it was meant to be that single working age benefit for those who were on means tested benefit. But it's not.
It is.
It was going to be, but then Council Tax went
But with respect, Chairman, the whole point about this is that universal credit collects up those benefits that are relevant to work, the means tested elements of it, and basically what we do is we simplify that process and make sure that they act as an incentive to go back to work. That has always been a reality, that around the edges of that there are always particular conditions and issues that need to be dealt with sensitively, and we believe better dealt with locally. So you allow for local intervention, because the truth is, I think it's better to have things like the social fund done locally, because at least then there's a chance they get face-to-face discussions with people. We've had in the past, social fund payments that have been, many payments, so people are treating them as a kind of top-up to their benefits, and no one really asks the question, what is their problem? What is the issue there? So now what we're doing is moving it to that point where we can start to deal with the problem that's at the root cause of why they're getting into situations where they can't pay their debts, they can't budget, or they're having difficulties. So now at least we can begin to focus, and that's the arrangement really with that Lord Freud is talking about, with local authorities, getting them to work with us, and these are the discussions we're having with them at the moment.
But all of that takes money. Anyway, I want to move on to monthly payments, because there's quite a lot of the evidence that we've received is that there's a huge concern about monthly payments, not just about those who are used to budgeting either weekly or fortnightly, but just in terms of the nature of universal credit. If something goes wrong, then it's all. In some cases, it will be all of their income that will be that they won't get. So there are going to be people who will not manage their monthly payments. There has to be, even if it's 10% or 20%. Like in our numbers, what arrangements are going to be in place for those? And again, as back to Glenda Jackson's point, how will you identify the most vulnerable in order to give them an option?
Okay, can I just put the first base in as to what we're doing, why we're doing it, and hand then the details over to Lord Freud. Can I just say, first of all, this is part of that process. It says, look, the problem with the system we've got, apart from its complexity of the benefits, is that it's actually a system that is set around the problems of a minority of people in the benefit system, and the majority then have to be part of that. For example, paying people originally weekly, then fortnightly, the reality of the direct payment, all these things set around people who find difficulty in coping. We know they're in the system, but the reality for the majority is simply this. The majority of the people, including in tax credits, cycle in and out of the benefit system, either through temporary work or completely in and out because they fall out of work for a period and they come in. 75% of those in work are on monthly payments at the moment, and that is a figure that is rising all the time. So in other words, employers want to put people into monthly payments. One of our big problems is when people fall out of work, they go from what is a standard monthly payment often to then having to figure out that they're in fortnightly, so it's awkward for them. So getting this set for the majority is critical so that we can get that cycle. The second bit of this, which is important, and he's going to deal with the individual cases on this, is that for those who have been longer term unemployed and have got used to fortnightly, the point about this is now the barrier to work is that going to monthly payments once you're in work is the wrong moment to identify when you have a problem, because that means you're likely to crash out of work at that point because you can't cope. We need to get them to cope before they go to work and centre up responsibilities, hub up these issues around them so that we can deal with them to get them through their problems. And that's really what sort of Lord Freud, he's now going to talk to you about some of the details.
But just on that second, what sort of temporary transitional arrangements would you then have for people moving from 2 weeks to 4 weeks? Because people in that particular cohort, they're severely financially constrained.
Well, some of them are. Oh, goodness Lord, I'm going to actually get him now to talk about that in detail, but I just wanted to make a headline point. This is a positive for those who are out of work. And remember, we did manage a transition from 1 to 2, and we were told by everybody it would be a disaster. It is possible to manage people from there to a month. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, these issues are all related. The direct payments, the monthly payments, the split payments, who gets it, are all areas which kind of circle the same issue.
And I have to say, they're probably the same people that are digitally excluded.
Exactly. So what
are the arrangements for them? That's what I want to know. It's the unusual ones.
The decision that we have taken is that it is not right to create in Universal Credit a proto-bank account which makes the payments and does the splits and all of that. That is not the smart thing to do. The smart thing to do is to move that payment through into a proper banking system. And that is what we've decided to do. And that means that we can, in that provision, we can make direct payments to landlords. We can reserve some money for discretionary spending, and so on and so forth. This is the classic, in the jargon, the jam jar account. And I think we can we are announcing today, and we are revealing right now to the committee, that we have just put out a document requesting expressions of interest from the financial community on how to create some of those products. We're prepared to subsidise them, and the announcement talks about a running figure of up to £140 million to make sure that people have got the ability to manage the finances and then get support to do so. So that is one of the most vital parts of modernising the system, is that we're allowing people to take control of their lives and get rid of the poverty premium which we have imposed on people by giving them dribs and drabs of money, so they can never buy anything at all.
For the 2 weeks.
Okay, 2 weeks of what? Sorry, Stephen Lloyd. What we're doing is arranging an advance for people so that they don't see any gap in their payments. So there is a provision that we've designed in so that there's they can fill the hole if they need to as they move from a fortnightly system to a monthly system.
Good, I'm very encouraged with that. That's the first I've heard of it, so I think that sounds like a very good idea.
We can, if we believe, and we have a very good understanding at the moment of those already in difficulty and budgeting problems, etc. One of this brings all that information together. We can transition them over a longer period if necessary. I mean, the real point is understanding which family has a problem, then you work with them to get them through this process, and so you may need to break it up.
Because that dealt with a major anxiety of mine, that particular group would be a percentage, that they'll then be driven to payday loan companies or what have you. So
again, the majority dealt with, now we can focus on the minority, and that's the key.
So no, we have that, that provision is in the Universal Credit.
Right.
Could I just ask, so the minority who will be afforded this change in payments,
yes.
They're the same minority of the most vulnerable, are they?
Well, anyone transitioning onto Universal Credit from other systems will be allowed will have a facility to take an advance to meet any shortfall for the period before the first formal sets of payments are made. So we have put that into the system. So it's not a question of vulnerability, it's a question of if they think that's what they need. The interesting thing is, as Secretary of State pointed out, is when we when the Department transitioned from 1 week to 2 weeks, there was a lot of provision put aside for exactly that reason. And in fact, remarkably little of those funds were drawn down by
so anyone
claimants.
moving on to universal credit, regardless of my definition of what constitutes, anybody going on to universal credit can say, I want to be paid 2 weekly.
No, he can say, I need an advance to bridge the gap as I go on to the monthly system.
Well, we will look at it.
And that lasts for what?
Yeah.
One payment, 2 payments?
One payment just to get you on. Then you get a lump sum monthly payment, and then you're on the monthly payment system.
So you get 6 weeks' pay, actually.
Well, you get an interim. There's an interim payment advance
of 2 weeks.
Of 2 weeks
and
to
then
get
you go on
stage
to the monthly payment.
Yes.
1 month.
So you in effect get. Is it a block payment of 6 weeks of universal credit?
No, it'll be
2 weeks and then 4 weeks.
Well,
stage payment.
It will be in practice. I mean, it'll depend exactly on the timing. But if you're moving from a 2-week system, there will be an advance at the 2-week point to bridge you over into the full 1 month payment.
Then we look at those, for example, that already nominated have serious issues, budgeting issues, and we have to work with the authorities on those people to make sure we get them through from 2 weeks to 1 month and stabilise them and deal with their problems. So that allows you to focus on those people separately.
But you've said about this is about treating people as grown-ups as though they were in work, but actually it's very opposite because you're not giving them any choice whatsoever. A lot of people in work get weekly payments. In fact, a number of people pay their rent weekly. Now that's going to be quite difficult to transition into monthly because there aren't 4 weeks in a month.
This is why, as Lord Freud talked about, what this is also means that we do is we work with people so that through those banking products and others that there are ways in which you manage your money far better than you do at the moment, and that's the process. And he talked about those products that we're talking about. Some have referred to jam jar accounts and various other direct debit processes. But the reality is a lot of those that have been working through in the trials who have never been in banking have actually moved to that very successfully. So the point is, what we're not doing is treating them all as though they're infants. We're saying, okay, one of the barriers is that the vast majority of people in work are paid monthly. You are, for the most part, going to have to fit in with that. The days when, we have a system at the moment that's still set around the idea that somebody leaves a factory gate and gets cash in their pocket once a week or maybe a fortnight. Those days have long gone. For some, they're still there. But there's, vast majorities want to go on monthly. We have to get them ready for that. That's what this is about. I'm
conscious, and I've got lots more on that, but just before I leave, I'm not sure I got an answer about the extra resources for local authorities. Going to try this one then. Will there be extra resources for the advice sector to assist with the transition to universal credit?
Well, the very simple answer to that is wherever we need it, if it is needed and support is needed, then the government obviously provides that. But my point is we have to figure out whether it's needed and where that will fall.
Can I make a plea then, have a parliamentary helpline, because whatever the issues, strengths and weaknesses, we will have a lot of people coming into our constituencies.
We're going to have an MP's hotline. Sorry, I don't know if we should have said that. We've agreed to have an MP's hotline, so you'll be able to get straight on to it.
We will both find some funding in response to our question. We will find some funding for the advisory sector, and we can commit today, I think, to have an MP's hotline.
Okay. Glenda, I'm just sorry.
Well, we've agreed
we will never get through everything else. I really need to move on. If we're going on to real-time information, and Teresa has some questions.
Thank you. Just before we go on to real-time information, Lord Freud, you said there were 15 local authorities in this pilot. Could you let us know who they are?
Yes. It's probably easier for me to write to you. Yeah.
And also, I believe that there is a single district and single contact centre where you're piloting getting more people on GSA online.
Well, we're doing that. That's not the same pilot. This is in other areas. There's a number of areas we're doing.
I know it's not the same pilot, but there is also a pilot to get people on GSA online.
Yes, but there's a number of places. We can give you the list of those that are doing it.
I was told it was a single district and a single contact.
Well, actually, it's the pilot itself, but we're already rolling out more computers into the job centres.
Okay, so you could let me know at a later time which single district and which single contact centre and the 15 local authorities. That'd be really helpful. Real-time information. Witnesses, including the CBI and the Institute of Chartered Accountants, have told us that many small businesses are going to struggle to comply with the timetable. And I think Sage, massive payroll software provider, did a survey across 1,000 small businesses, and 36% of them were unaware of the upcoming real-time information changes. That was last month. But Does that worry you?
Well, if I start this off, the RTI, there was a consultation in 2010 summer, and we adjusted how the RTI would work to use existing systems that companies already use to communicate with HMRC, and those were perfectly adequate for us to run our system of the universal credit. We'll get enough information from that methodology to be able to pay the universal credit. Now, what then happened, the software providers built the systems needed to adapt existing payroll provision, and the pilot started this spring. Yeah. The pilots have, in practice, gone rather more smoothly than we would have expected, certainly than I expected.
Is that because of the class of employers you're working with?
They took a range from very big to very small, right down to an employer who was the CEO who did his own payroll. And so it started with 10, then they went up to 300, and so on and so on. So currently there are now more or less 2 million employees on the system as we speak, going through it. And it has gone surprisingly smoothly. I say this because I was, as would anyone be, concerned with how a big change like this would go through. But it seems to have gone very well, and and you can tell that because the level of noise in the system as people move over to it is remarkably low. And that what's happening now is that software providers and employers who have kind of stood back a bit from this new system have actually now come forward, and HMRC have actually accelerated the introduction of new employers in this current period. So we are on target to get a large number in by next April when we start our Pathfinders, and to complete the transfer over by next October. And the view of the officials running the process is one doesn't want to give that, giving someone 18 months notice of a new system coming in when it's relatively straightforward for them to do a relatively straightforward change is counterproductive, because they kind of forget about it. So a build-up that's relatively rapid in terms of introduction for this kind of system seems to be appropriate. So that's what their experience is, and they have done it building up carefully.
Could you just clarify, because software suppliers had indicated to us that there was insufficient time for them to develop the products because they hadn't had the specifications from HMRC. Are you saying that's been resolved now?
Yes, that's now been resolved. There was early concern from the software providers about how much time they had, and that concern has basically gone away.
Plus, HMRC are offering free software now to the smallest companies, so that's already on their scales. Do you want? It might be useful for us to run some of the numbers past them on the trial.
Yes. Yeah.
It might be useful to you because by September, that 1.9 million individual records, that's 1,500 PAY employee schemes. Of those, something like 1,230 are small employers. By March 2013, they're talking about over 6 million individual records up on the scheme, 250,000 PAYE schemes. April adds about another 1.2 million small employers, and October about another 1.6 million. So you can see the build-up is reasonably rapid. Yeah. So that's just to give you a sort of thumbnail sketch of it. And of those, as I say at the moment, don't rush on that, it's important for us to understand what we need. Of RTI, we actually have a much smaller subset of requirement than the whole of the RTI system. We are using and we will use for universal credit until they get the whole thing completed, what's called the EDI, which is the electronic data interchange system, which is already in existence. And we have alongside that also an internet channel. These are things that they already use, that small employers use for passing their data back and forwards with HMRC. We're using that, and from that we need, give or take, about a third of the amount of data that is required for the RTI process from employers. So we don't need all of that. Universal credit already essentially is on a track which is, part of, but is actually an easier subset of that. So it's not a complete thing for us.
Lord Freud, you said that the pilot had gone well. What didn't go well? What did you learn? What issues were identified?
Well, that was, I had exactly the same question as we got briefed on this weekly. And there was remarkably, the concerns, the big concerns were data matching, that someone would send information about an employee, and there was no record of it at the other end at HMRC, so they didn't know what information about who was being sent. And and what that meant was that the employers that sent dirty data along, they would be contacted to be correct, to make sure it was matchable data. I think they're currently running at, and I'll be nudged from behind if I'm wrong, 99.8% matching, so that there's work on 0.2% to get that correct. So that was the big issue. One of the issues being that they had put in a whole bank of a team to do the telephone responses of people with problems, and they actually were pretty underoccupied because it was relatively straightforward. So, but that was an internal issue of over investment.
Yes, it would be, though, the relatively compliant employer who would volunteer for this scheme, and there will be employers who are not compliant, and to get them up to speed in such a short space of time is going to take a lot of effort.
Well, I mean, one can only go by the pilots and what people have trialling.
I mean, the real point behind that, presumably in the pilot, you've ensured that some more challenging employers are included in the pilot. There's no point going to a bunch of employers who have just picked up.
Yeah, the first handful were literally 10 employers in the first month or two. And then, it was 300, now it's 1,300, and by then you're getting people whose systems aren't quite as straightforward. Yeah. And you're learning the whole time. But actually, people are finding it's literally pressing one extra button. You do the payroll and you press one button to send that information over to HMRC. And then what happens technically is that information goes to HMRC, the payment goes through the banking system, and there's a match of the two records. It's called the hash, which is matched across. And that's what happens. But it makes it rather easy for the, if the software's working, and there were examples originally in the first couple of months where the button wasn't switched on properly. Once the button is switched on properly, it is a relatively straightforward process when you're doing the payroll.
So what you have is you have an employer who runs the payroll, presses the switch, informs HMRC of what they've paid on the payroll.
Yes. Yeah.
Assuming they pay by backs, that's then verified with backs.
Yes.
What if they don't pay by backs and they pay by cheque?
90, I think the figure is 96% of payments are made through backs. So if they're not paid through backs, it's a kind of a non-electronic check system.
Yeah. So you can understand people's reticence to believe that the HMRC computer system will work, given it's relatively recently that if people had more than one job and were reported at the end of the year to HMRC couldn't match those two people up, people ended up underpaid. So this is quite a short time frame between that happening and now this, which is real time, real information. So there is a concern about that.
Well, I mean, it's connected.
Well, let me just deal with that point. Yeah. One of the reasons for that, it's because, the issue is at the end of the year, what happens to people who are in part-time work is their hours change quite regularly, and sometimes they add some jobs for a short period and not at all. And the problem was they were meant to go and tell HMRC when they changed under the tax credit system, and us obviously when it affected their benefits. And of course many of them got confused about this and didn't. So at the end of the year they struggled to figure out how many hours. So what happened was, the present system, they forecast, and invariably their forecasts are wrong. So what the monthly payment thing will do, most of these companies are actually, if they're half well run, are collecting the data as they go along. Now all we're saying is as they collect it, then they transfer that data. At the moment they collect it to the end of the year. The only people that don't do that on a monthly basis are HMRC.
I understand that, but I wasn't actually talking about under or overpayments of tax credits. I was talking about the number of people who came to us as MPs who maybe had a pension plus a part-time job plus something else, and their P60s, P14s were sent to HMRC at the end of the year. HMRC had them for 2 years, never matched the data, even though the NI numbers were there. So all I'm saying is people's confidence in HMRC developing this is low.
But
that's why
I think what the two halves of your question are actually the answer to each other, because the problem if that doesn't sound if I can explain what I meant, the problem of a system which reconciles everything at the end of the year is really tough.
But they didn't even do that.
Well, it's tough. I mean, some people will have up to 17 employments in a year.
No, I quite understand
and
that.
It is just, and the reason that it's attractive to HMRC to go to an RTI feed is that you're reconciling monthly.
I absolutely agree, Lord Freud. It is attractive, and from a Treasury point of view, it means you get the PAYE on time instead of getting it as a late payment at the end of the year. I know it's attractive, and I know it's an excellent idea. I just am concerned that they can actually do it. So just to move on, so we've got the employer who submits the information. It goes to HMRC. It will be in real time, so then the DWP will know what they have to pay in universal credit and whether that needs to be flexed from month to month. Is the bridge between HMRC's computer and the DWP's computer built or working?
Yeah, we're testing that bridge this month. Yeah.
So it's not.
It is. Well, we're testing
live yet.
No, it's not live yet. But we're testing the bridge, the mechanics of the bridge now, and we will be getting live feeds over. We're getting, what we're doing now is we're doing that with dummy data, and we'll be starting to get live real data for our trial Pathfinder in April.
Do you have a plan B in case it doesn't work?
Our plan B. First of all, before I answer this, because I know you're not answering did I stop beating my wife question, it looks to me as if this system is pretty robust, and what we're seeing is we have a comfort level on this. But if it wasn't to happen or didn't happen for a month, the plan B would be that people would put in their own monthly figures in the way that the self-employed will put them in. So we can see how much they earn and pay them the appropriate amount to make sure that they have a standard of living maintained on a month-by-month basis.
Okay, just last question, which actually isn't to do with that, it's to do with what we were talking about earlier.
Well,
can I just ask just a quick question about the telephone helplines? If people do need to claim by telephone, will they be 0845 numbers? Or will they be local numbers?
I think they're going to be local numbers. I think that's our decision.
Because 0845 numbers are really expensive if you've
and you know with our telephone system that it automatically transfers around the country, so it always finds the blank spot that they can answer. So they get moved, they're called and moved to wherever, and they're always informed. That goes on at the moment.
I'm happy to move on.
How will an employee know whether their employer is on RTI?
Clearly, there are some examples of people, and the people you're concerned about, as are we, are the people doing, maybe just a night, very, very casual labour, where we will need to know, the employer and the employee need to work out, is that system going on the RTI or not? We're currently elaborating how that will work exactly, because there may be examples where someone is paid casually and will need to report themselves directly. I mean, this is this kind of difficult line between very casual employment and self-employment. So there's a line there, and it's kind of, there will be specific guidance, but in practice, where the automatic check will be the payment coming through, and people be able to see their own.
But the employer that's likely not to be on RIT will be probably a small employer employing some people cash in hand, not necessarily putting things properly through the books. They will also be the ones who will be paying the low wages, so the claimant in that situation will be the most disadvantaged, probably the one that's not computer literate. So you're actually asking for a very sophisticated ability from the claimant to be able to let you know, to know that that information hasn't gone from their employer, and to let you know week by or month by month how much they've earned, to be able to go into the system and put all that information in. That's that's way beyond the computer abilities of many.
There clearly, there are at these margins. That is exactly where we need to put some effort to make sure that that we get absolutely clear.
But Lord Freud, I don't think they are at the margins. That's the point, because the client group are going to be the most marginalised anyway, and those who will be in the lowest paid jobs. So they will also not be with the big employers who are very small.
So what I was referring to someone who was doing labour one night and didn't do it again. If you're doing it more than that, you're on the accounting systems, the payroll systems of the employer in legal terms. And if you're on that system, doesn't matter if you're paid cash or through backs, it will come through, and we will see it through HMRC. So it's a very small number of people doing the odd job for one person and never again that we have a concern about. Normally, the system, if people operating legally have got an obligation to, everyone has an obligation to put it through payroll, legal operation, put it through payroll, and inform
and we
HMRC.
We will have a link with HMRC to check that data. So it's legally on the thing, we check the data against it, so they'll be picked up.
The employers' organisation, Federation of Small Business and others, and some of the evidence we got from the accounting bodies, is that a large number, might only be 10%, but that's still in terms of the number of employers who are not, who do not have the digital capacity to provide all this information to HMRC. They're not doing it just now. They're doing it the old-fashioned way, but they're not doing it just now. And the chances of them getting up and running, because they'll have to be up and running from day one, because your Pathfinder, you don't know where these people are, and they could be in those exact employers.
To the extent that we've got a kind of a digital deficit with a small group of employers, we will have to address it, just as we're addressing it for the benefit claimants. So clearly, to the extent that there are genuinely employers who are not on the system, we'll have to address it. One of the things we're looking at currently is is to make sure that they can use an intermediary, in other words, an accountant, because that, I think normally the people who are not digital are actually using someone else to do it for them.
Absolutely.
And one of the things we'll look at doing is making sure that they can use an accountant, a bit like the trusted intermediary system, to come into the system on their behalf.
They anyway have to be on the system for HMRC, and the point is that we will simply set up around them to make sure that their records are established with us, and we check against those totals. That's, again, the exception rather than the rule, and we're already talking to them about doing just that.
I think Teresa wanted to come back in.
One last thing, an area that bothers me is the hospitality industry, which is the hospitality industry.
Yes.
There's lots of people on low earnings working as waiters, waitresses, casual work.
Yes.
The employer will, through real-time information, declare the wages.
Yes.
What about the tips and gratuities? Because
Well, there's two ways that they work.
I mean, if it's a trunk, it'll be fine.
Yeah, yes, if they're on the trunk, it will go through on the RTI system as wages in the normal way.
But if it's cash tip,
if it's a cash tip, the employee will be required to put that into the universal credit system.
So that would be
we
the
make an
same for
adjustment.
hairdressers?
Yeah. Tips are counted as income.
Will I understand that, but will the problem will be is you will have people who are working as waiters and waitresses, and because the more automated something is and the more high tech, the more they think it's all been done. So will there be any sort of advertising campaign amongst people who work in those industries to make them understand that that needs to be declared? It's
a good point, and and I think it makes a lot of sense. So I take the point.
People think HMRC know everything anyway.
What we will try and do, because a lot of it will be UC based on the entry, then we have to make it very clear from the beginning that this is an element that they themselves are responsibility for. It's a cash payment, and that'll be clear on the UC entry form. The point is that the other stuff automatically goes through, but it'll be very clear to them cash payments are their responsibility to enter. And they'll see that as they go in, and therefore they will be asked that question: do you have cash?
But because tips and gratuities are, unless you work in an industry like that, people don't understand it. It needs to be that the advisors were aware and told people.
And that's where we can deal with it at the front end. That's very important. They go onto it first time, they see that box, and they fill the box in.
No, but it's a very good suggestion.
Yeah, it's a very good suggestion.
We'll pick it up.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We're going on treatment of earnings, so there's more questions on that from Stephen.
Thank you very much, Chair. Obviously, the whole issue of the earning disregards has been a matter of an awful lot of debate. So I've got a series of questions on that. First off, Secretary of State, when do you expect to decide on the final amounts of earnings disregards and the standard allowance and amounts for children under universal credit?
Well, we will do that. I can't give you an exact date, to be quite frank with you, because it's something that we're constantly keeping under review whilst we look at the new information we get regarding to how we balance this out. But we will be publishing them as and when we fix them.
I mean, it's obviously only a matter of months before the whole thing goes.
Yeah, well, it will be long in advance of that. But my point is that we will certainly come, very happily explain them to the committee when we do. But right now, a number of these things obviously move and adjust as we do the OBR setup, but after that process we should be in a much stronger position to publish them.
So the timing is likely to be with the regulations, which we've decided it makes sense to put out after the autumn statement.
Okay, so I mean on that basis,
all that process first before, but can't give an exact date on that, but it will be
fine. So but
within a reasonable time. Anyway.
I'd certainly like to take you up on that offer. So, Chair, I suggest that after we've got those figures, then that would be a very, very good time where you could come in and quiz you on that. Are you able to give any sort of steer on how you expect they will compare with existing benefit rates, or do we just have to wait for the autumn statement?
We've put out some indicative figures.
That was very difficult to read. It was a chart, and you had to look at it.
And the fundamentals of it are that the elements are based on the existing benefit structure. So the base position is that if you are unemployed on the full amount, it's likely that it adds up to the same amount. That's how the structure is developed. Yeah. The one area we're looking at, and we've said we're looking at very closely, is the structure of the disregards, because we've had feedback that they are pretty complicated, and we want to make sure that people can really understand what disregards are, so that they're incentivized to go to work, because that's the point of the whole system.
It was the one I was making, that until we're set on that, there'd be no point in publishing stuff that we are actually changing.
No, I can understand that, and certainly we'll look forward to a second evidence session after the autumn statement. Some of the witnesses who came and gave evidence to the Select Committee also suggested that the revised system of earnings disregards actually introduces more complexity rather than increased simplicity, and that the original approach offered a better solution. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, but that was did come from a number of...
Sorry, which can I ask you? So they said some approach, I didn't hear you.
Sorry. A number of witnesses suggested that the proposed system, the revised system of universal credit, would actually end up even more complex than what we've currently got. Now, that's not particularly a view I share, but I think I'd be interested to hear from the Secretary of State how you would actually face on to people who believe that even if they may have agreed in principle with the original concept of universal credit, they're now beginning to, or some organisations are now coming out with lines that say it would be even more complicated than what we've currently got. I mean, do you just...
I just want to say one thing. The key point to bear in mind is, the key issue is the impact on the person who is in receipt of this as they cross over into work. That's the key point, really, about the disregards. And for them, it's a much simpler experience once they're on the system, once they're registered. I don't actually see why organisations would be saying this right now, because, as I said, we haven't published the detail about these. So for them to make assumptions about this, I think, is a little bit previous. And my answer to that is, we are already taking into consideration concerns that they may have and other objectives that we learn during the course of this process. So I don't think actually that's going to be the case, and I think it's actually still ultimately a much simpler process, and the key person to understand in that process is the person who is signing on, the person that's actually making the claim in the first place. Do you want to go into that?
Can I just clarify it slightly? It was the Children's Society and CAB. Your original proposal for the way that disregards would work around housing benefit, for instance, they're saying was simpler than the one that you've changed it to, you've revised it to. That's made it more complex. So that was, they thought that in trying to help, you've made it worse. I think it was basically...
Well, I mean, as I just said, and I think we are looking closely at the disregards again, while we're very comfortable with the kind of level of the elements here, which indicated, we're looking at the disregards to make sure that there is an element of simplicity and logic to them that people can understand, because it's no good having an incentive to work. And these things, these disregards are a massive incentive for people to work, because they rip down the marginal deduction rates for people, particularly as they at the participation rate level. So they're vital that not only do they have that financial incentive, but people can understand them so that they act on them. So to the extent that people are feeding back to us some concern about the simplicity, we are looking at that closely.
And our point is that when we come to publish them, our belief is what we will publish is the best balance that keeps it simple but also gives good effect, and that's the important thing. Simplicity is one of the issues, but the best effect on those entering work is the key to all of us. That is to say, their marginal deduction rates actually are far better as a result of the decisions we make on these.
What about within that, again within this cohort, there will be a fairly substantial number of people who would define themselves as self-employed, all of the various different roles. Again, some witnesses who gave evidence to the Select Committee believe that the proposed minimum income floor rules for self-employed universal credit claimants may act as an obstacle to those wishing to expand their business. Is that something that's come within your understanding or concern?
Well, we can talk about it. You pick it up first and I'll carry on.
Yeah, I mean, this was an area where there was quite a lot of feedback, especially through SAC, and we've been looking at this closely. What we need to balance with the self-employed is a system that encourages people to be self-employed and then to go on ratcheting up their efforts. And the current system has got a significant number of people in it who kind of stay at a very low level of activity and are being encouraged to stay in that activity through the tax credit system. So we will have a far more active relationship with the self-employed than HMRC have under tax credits, in the sense that the low-earning self-employed will be subject to similar conditionality as to the employed, so there's going to be a balance there, unless they go above the minimum income floor, which takes them out of that conditionality regime. So what we're aiming to do is to balance up the position of the employed and the self-employed. But one of the issues that we needed to address with the self-employed is to inject an incentive to allow people to be entrepreneurs. Yeah. And so we put in an allowance for a year where there is no conditionality if you're going into
genuine... This is the first time we're saying this to...
No, not this.
The 5-year one. Okay, the 5-year one.
Secretary of State has made another announcement, so well, why don't you make the announcement?
Well, you do your 1 year and we'll do the other one.
Well, no, I think I finished the 1 year. Well, that's history. Why don't you tell them the extra?
Well, carry on. You carry on.
Okay, I'll do it. Well, as the Secretary of State basically made an announcement, we've looked very closely at how often people should have the opportunity to have a year to build a business without any conditionality. And in the original proposition regulations, that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Right.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of feedback from people saying that is not economically sensible, that actually a lot of people have one attempt, doesn't work, and then they come back and they should be supported again. So we are looking at now, as the Secretary of State said, running that year. You can have it every 5 years.
Yeah.
On a 5-year basis.
Which is a response,
you
direct
have it
response.
4 or 5 years, you can have one every 5
yes.
years.
Yes. So you'd have a chance to build a business.
Yeah.
It didn't work.
And that's new. We've only just...
That is
directly as a response to some of the feedback from the small businesses. We're talking to them. We still haven't finalised that, but that is where we think we'll end up. So it gives us flexibility and gives a bit of fairness. But the key point, a lot of them, I mean, you get some of the groups that are actually static, sitting on zero earnings for a long period of time and receive tax credits, and that's not a good place to be, frankly, either, which is the point that Lord Freud was making. You know, you need to get people actually developing through this process, rather like you would if they were employed.
I'm encouraged by that, because the current proposal basically penalises failure, so it kills its own dead, and that's daft, because one of the things with starting a business, or small thing, if it's washing windows or what have you, sometimes it takes a couple of goes before it actually gets...
Yeah, so this is why we're responding to that, and we think that'll help, and we've actually talked to a number of the organisations about this.
Just to get clear in my mind, it's 1 year in every 5?
Yes.
Right.
That's what we're looking at.
Okay,
which we think is pretty much by the rule.
I mean, one of the...
Can I go back to the minimum income floor rules? Because that was in the essential question. Because the low income tax reform group have got a couple of worked examples, which you'll find in the evidence they give to us, which shows that someone in employment earning a net amount more than the self-employed, because of the this floor, actually will end up getting more universal benefit than the self-employed did, and that's the basis of the question. Is that at that level, that because of the floor, it will be a disincentive to entrepreneurship.
I mean, that's interesting. I've actually just been talking to the group, and they made the point, and we're taking it away just to have a look, just to double check, because I mean, what we're going to make sure is that there is parity between self-employed and employed, and the extent that there isn't,
we'll sort that out.
We'll sort that out. So that's a technical issue that we will sort.
That you're looking at.
Yeah.
Another group, hardly accused of being completely radical, but the Institute of Chartered Accountants, they say, and use their word, that they are appalled that a simplified cash basis is being imposed on universal credit claimants without any proper consultation on the underlying policy. I don't know whether you've come across that or how much consultation you've done with the Chartered Accountants.
We are talking to various groups. I mean, the issue I think that's underneath this is the extent to which the rules for universal credit are the same or different from the tax rules of HMRC. And there's an interesting, chicken and egg here, because the HMRC were consulting on their regulations and we hadn't seen sight of the final position. But what I can say is that we are settling down with them to make sure that we are running the two systems consistently, and we'll be making the appropriate adjustments to make sure that happens both ways.
Thank you for that. Explain to me again then, because the big issue for them is why we've chosen, or you've chosen, a cash-based accounting system. That's their sort of.
In practice, it's not. It's the same system as the definitions of the Inland Revenue. Sorry, I'm showing my age, as HMRC use. And we are just bringing that all into line. One of the issues that I think may be behind that is the issue of whether there can be carry forwards of losses and profits, and I think that might be the issue between the cash. And that is something that we are going to look at. We have that kind of system for the employed, with large amounts and spreading it. Yeah. So we'll look very closely at that issue.
And remember, our job here is to deal with, is a point that we were making, the temporary cash shortfall. That's what we do. It's different perhaps from what their understanding of what we do is. I think that may lead to the issue.
I agree. I think that's a very significant announcement. So I think, sorry, Teresa.
I'm a bit confused there, because if you're basically doing your accounts monthly or weekly or yearly, and you're doing them on a cash basis, probably HMRC would recommend against that and ask you to do it on an accounts basis, so you do it on what you'd invoiced rather than what you'd actually received in cash. So are self-employed people they have to have two sets of accounts? One for
we will make them consistent. So we will be taking the same figures and definitions.
So it will be the cash they actually received rather than what they
invoiced. But what's important is that when you're looking at this isn't tax. This is universal credit. This is the welfare support for people.
But it's going through the tax system.
I know. Well, it's the same figures, but what we're actually concerned about is how much money does that family have in their pocket that month to live on. So cash is real. So
different from what the tax
So we'll use the same definitions, but we're trying to make sure the family can buy their food.
What we want to end up at this point is addressing this point about this temporary cash shortage is a critical issue for us within this. So we are sorting that through and aligning it on that basis. But we have a different set of priorities from the Inland Revenue.
I mean, as you say, it's how much money do you actually have in your wallet or in your purse is what matters. So that will be the amount of cash or cheque or whatever you'd receive from your customers if you're self-employed. But HMRC try and discourage people from using that as an accounts basis. They tried to get people to use a more sophisticated system. So maybe that's a chat you can have with HMRC.
I can assure you, we are having some rather deep chats at the moment with HMRC, but with the view to get these definitions right, so that people can make a report and the information there basically rolls over into their tax report. But it's a relatively simplified reporting of the cash position. And the issue, I think, that is concerning people is the carry forwards when when there's big expenditure one month and not in the other, and those imbalances, and that is something we do need to look at.
Yeah.
And so would the answer to that be there would be a case in some examples of people who are self-employed for end of year rationalisation, as you do with tax credits, because month by month you're not going to get an accurate account of what their true income is spread out over the year.
That's right. That's the point. But we'll have the kind of these carry. Sorry, when I say that, we are looking at that. Yeah. We have a system for that. It might be that 1 month they're grossly overpaid. Yeah, exactly.
How do you claw back?
Yeah, but remember, the point I was trying to make earlier on is our absolute base position has to be this temporary shortage that we have to resolve. The rest we resolve with HMRC over this, and that's how it works.
I think we're moving on to another topic. Very quickly. Yeah.
I'm going right back, forgive me for this. But the Chair raised the issue of evidence that had been presented to us with regard to the changes that you have instituted for housing benefit. And I believe there was an announcement today that 2 categories of cancer sufferers, based on their treatment, will no longer be regarded as being fit for work. So what I'm trying to find out here is what causes you to change your mind. I mean, is it pressure, or is it actually the principles of fairness, or is it simplicity? Because there seems, I mean, I welcome the flexibility in this particular instance, don't misunderstand me, but, you have left an awful lot of people in a great deal of anxiety for a very long time.
Well, no, on the, I think we're merging 2 different issues here. You're talking about the ESA issues concerning how we treat people in the support group versus in the RAG, etc.
Yes.
Well, the point was we brought in Professor Harrington to look at all of these areas from the beginning of this, and he's made a series of recommendations. He then consulted on the cancer and then looked at other areas of cancer treatment, and this is part of that process that we finally reached a conclusion on balance what is best. He's made a recommendation, and we're adopting the recommendations. And that's how the process worked on ESA.
And that's an ongoing process?
Ongoing. We didn't just bring him in once. We said it's a perpetual process with him, and that's how it's been tackled. So,
and if I can just take the general point that I think you were making, which is how we've been working with outside groups. I mean, this has been a very open process, the creation of Universal Credit, and we have really benefited from having open dialogue with numerous groups outside, and we've done a huge amount of effort to have that communication, including indeed with parliamentarians, and we've been incorporating those ideas and thoughts into the regulations and the guidance to make sure the system works. This is a huge endeavour that we're going to rebuilding the whole of the benefits system, and it requires a lot of input, careful thought and balancing from the community as a whole. And we've had a lot of very constructive engagement right the way through this process to help us do it. And we do not have a monopoly of getting this right. I mean, we must get the feedback from people.
And thank you for that. On that, I'm actually going to take you back to one area that I still have a challenge with. Even though I actually appreciate some of the announcements that you made today, I think they've been very, very valuable. It's back to the council tax thing. Now, I know that there are some complexities around it within government and Treasury, the Secretary of State for DLG and the DWP, but how do we avoid getting universal credit right, getting the IT right, getting everything right, getting the earnings disregard right, but because of the council tax benefit being outside it, that actually the overall process means that people will not keep more of their work in low-paid jobs. I mean, that's to me, that's something I've got real.
Well, can I just first of all talk about the generality of this in terms of how we do it? And the man that's involved in a lot of that discussion is, of course, Lord Freud. So the point is that we recognise fully that if these two things aren't, in essence, clear with each other about how they work, then you could end up in the position that I know well, you raised with me on the floor of the House, etc., which is you could have a counteracting process that makes those marginal rates higher. So we're working very hard with local government to make sure that the system they set and the process of their tapers, whatever they introduce, does not do that. And that process is important for them to understand how it beds across with us. So that is an ongoing process. We feel quite positive about that. David, you want to talk about how that's gone?
I mean, one of the things that I mean, there's two key issues here. The one is that what the schemes are that the councils adopt, and the data that they use to to set their schemes. And the next is the effect on the universal credit, and clearly on the second, what's key is we were able to increase the disregards when the decision to move the council tax rebate over came up. We were able to increase the disregards, which meant that the number of overlapping tapers, was very substantially reduced. I mean, very few. And now what we're doing is we're talking with the local authorities through DCLG to make sure, and the devolved administrations, to make sure that we're passing over the right data so that they know who could be have a rebate or not. So that's the process that's happening. But in terms of the impact on the work incentives for universal credit, which is the big concern, the thing taking the strain there is the disregard.
Yeah, and the second part about that is that what Freud talked about consulting them, and this is what we're doing, and of course we've just put out the guidance on these elements to the local authorities, 350 I think it is.
Yes.
We've just gone out to them about. So this consultation has now gone to a new level, as it were, for them to understand, therefore, what our assumptions are under universal credit, and therefore what their overlapping assumptions must be. And that's the point of the discussion.
So you clearly appreciate and understand that if you don't get that bit right, then actually all the work and all the direction of travel that you're trying to do for almost the whole success of universal credit could be injected almost.
But the point that Lord Freud makes is an important one, which is, had we incorporated that, that would have changed the disregard. So what we've allowed for, to some degree, in discussion with them, is some flexibility with regards to that, so we can actually buy in some of this change, at the effect of it, should I say. But also now our assumptions are out there for them to look at and for us to discuss. So we want to get these down to a very marginal level, if any level at all.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I'm still trying to work out what it is you've just said there, but I'll maybe come back to you, because I still think it's going to be very difficult with regard to council tax, because it's going to be added in at a later date. And anyway, I've got quite a few questions here on housing costs and housing benefit, and looking again very often at those with the highest housing costs are vulnerable or in specialist accommodation. So what protection from the benefit cap will be provided for homeless households who are in temporary accommodation, who face higher rents but are unlikely to be able to pay the extra charges?
Yeah, I mean, on the there's two areas here, which is the exempt supported accommodation and the temporary accommodation, and this question is the temporary accommodation. Yeah. And the way that is based on the existing housing allowances plus an extra charge, and we're looking there. I mean, the main protection that we have on the benefit.
Is the extra charge the temporary accommodation subsidy? Is that what that is?
No, it's the service charge. I mean, it's running. I think it's running at £40. I think that's the plan. To run at £40 on top of the LHA. It's a simplified system. And the strain on there is to be taken by the increased level of discretionary housing payments in that area. The DHPs, which is running in the first year at 75 million and the second year at 45 million. So that's where the strain on the temporary housing is.
But this is an issue that won't go away, because there will be homeless people in temporary accommodation, which by its very nature is a lot more expensive, and in places like London will take you over the benefit cap.
Well, I think what you're referring to is the supported, exempt supported accommodation.
No, we've got a separate question on that.
Okay. Because we've pulled down...
Family and bed and breakfast accommodation, I suppose, is perhaps the way to characterise it.
Well, we've pulled down the rate of payment to the LHA rate, plus the extra element, the extra temporary accommodation element, which is running at the £40. That is the basic rate that we're running at, and then clearly we have a protective mechanism, which we may have to maintain for some time.
Many of those will be gone with the time we get to the full details of universal credit, because the whole objective is it's a smaller group that we're actually dealing with. So my sense about this is that you can look at these as a completely static group that are going nowhere over the next 2 years, or you can actually see them as a process of change, which
there will be a process of change. Well,
exactly
right. Otherwise
so but the point I wanted to make is we're already ahead of this, in the sense we're not waiting till April before you kick this off. You know, the Job Centre Plus and others have identified all the families, the 56,000 or so families that are there, and already now working with them, and many of those have already expressed real elements of change in their lives. I think something like a third have said that they're actually now going to be moving actively to be seeking work. So there's big changes coming in already for them before we hit April. So,
but we do not accept that this is likely to get worse because of the other changes in housing benefit. That means that a number of families are going to be homeless because they failed to pay their rent, because the rent was higher than the new local caps on housing benefit.
Well, a lot of that is already setting through. We started that process some time ago, so this is, beginning of this year, really. So by the time we get to the period of the universal credit, a lot of that will be taken through on the new contracts.
If you don't get this right, they end up on the street.
Yeah, well, my point is that we're not putting them on the street, and the key thing is that that's what the discretionary payments were set for, something in the order of 190 million, to make sure that process, regardless of universal credit, anywhere is managed. What Lord Freud's talking about is how you use it in conjunction with universal credit, but nonetheless it would be there and is already being used by local authorities to manage that process now. And the cap, the numbers of families we're talking about there for the department is actually a relatively small number of group when compared to the housing benefit group. So those effects are...
But quite a very disadvantaged group.
Yes, but the whole point about why we're starting already with them early on the basis of the cap is to identify them and to sort them out. Either if they have to move, then we move that process forward. If they have to buy out a certain amount of change for a period of time, then that is identified early. So that is already taking place right now in the department, as I say, having already identified that, working with local authorities. So all of those Job Centre Plus centres are working with the local authorities and have already got those names and details.
Okay. And we've got a question about sheltered accommodation and
just on that last point, I mean, I wonder how you can guarantee that people will not be made homeless, because not everyone who is not in permanent accommodation is being housed by a local authority. Many of them are in the private rented sector, and contrary to what you told us many, many months ago, Lord Freud, rents have not come down. So how are those families not going to be put out on the street?
We can have an argument about the rents come down, but in the early part of the year they were actually coming down.
Not in my constituency.
I was using an average figure.
This is a universal credit.
I was using an average figure, not that specific.
But it's universal.
Sorry, I can't. you distracted me. What?
The private rented sector, where rents are not coming down.
Yeah, dealing with the local housing allowance is really what your question is.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually, there are signs that there is some downward pressure on rents across the piece as a result of that. And clearly one needs to watch it month by month, but it's very difficult to counterfactual, as you know. I mean, we're in a dynamic market. You can't know that well what's happening as a result of anything specific. But there is some sign of some downward pressure for these for this community.
Well, I don't see this group vastly as a static group. This is where Wheel Park Company. I think this group is quite capable of changing some of what they do at the moment. As I said, the survey work on those groups that we're already talking to now shows a significant number of them already now engaged where they weren't before in seeking work to get into tax credits, which exempts them from the cap, but does actually give them a position back in the world of work. So there are changes already taking place with this group even before this is hit. I see these things in a dynamic sense, not in a static sense. So the discretionary payments are there to ease that process of change, really.
But those groups for whom local authorities have a statutory duty to house don't actually change. They are invariably families with children or individuals with severe disabilities.
Well, they are, but they are a mix of groups, some of them are already going to be affected by other work that we do, which is bringing more lone parents into the world of work when their second child hits 5. And looking at the survey work, it's interesting that the third said they're now definitely on the scale to look for work, which they weren't doing before. 88% are up to date now with their rent and coping with the original housing benefit rent changes, and only 1% so far have actually even had to report they've had to move. So in other words, they see where the dynamic element in change is, and they will attack that process with advice from us about how to improve their position. And that's why I see this as a dynamic group with some assistance will improve the quality of their lives.
So you can guarantee, can you, that no family, no individual with disabilities will be made homeless?
I see no reason why anybody should be made homeless.
That isn't the question I asked.
Well, we're dealing across housing, better and everything else, with large numbers of groups. Local
people.
Authorities, with respect, have to make these decisions. We have given them that discretionary money. I do not see the need for that. In our discussions with them, most of them that we've talked to don't. Some may want to take a political position on this. So my point is, what I've just tried to explain, Jackson, is that there is change already taking place. That is the process. Of course, there are difficulties. That's why we set up that fund of discretionary payments and increased it for the cap.
I mean, just to answer that specific point, though, people with disabilities or a household with someone with a disability are exempted from the benefit cap for that reason. That is the structure of the benefit cap. It is not designed to capture people who are disabled.
Do you want me to run through the exemptions here, because it seems as
I think we've got the exemptions.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm clearly not going to go much further with that, because I'm not getting answers that clarify the situation for me. So, however, there has been concern expressed about the service charges for supported housing. And in July 2011, you carried out a consultation on housing benefit reform in supported housing. When are you planning to publish your response to this consultation?
I'm not absolutely sure about the timing of our response, but I can tell you the direction of travel on it, which may be rather more helpful. This is one of the areas where there has been a great deal of concern expressed by various groups about the position of supported accommodation. And we are very concerned not to undermine their position. So we will be making sure that the supported accommodation structure of getting the payments and the support for what their costs are not changed, and we will look longer term at localizing that support. The issue that let's just take the most dramatic issue, a hostel looking after women who are fleeing domestic violence. They may only be there for 2 or 3 months, and that hostel is very concerned that setting up the whole UC system for them would just carve them out, particularly as their costs may be very different in structure to the normal housing costs. So we've heard that, and we will look to, as I say, to a system which does not rope them into the universal credit, and in fact we're looking at how best to make sure that support for those hostels, and all support accommodation, is kept on an even keel.
So either through the discretionary housing payments or even some direct
so
payment.
So you're categorically saying to this committee that all supporting housing, all supported housing,
exempt supported accommodation will be treated differently to other housing to make sure that we do not have the problem that people are
But who decides on the exemptions? You?
No, there's a technical definition of support exempt supported accommodation.
If they want.
There's a group of.
Well, can I give you an example? Well, the single room rate, which you're putting up to 25, apply for people who are under 25 but in supported accommodation. Because a lot of the homeless hostels or people who deal with young homeless have moved away from single rooms and into self-contained flats, but under the basic housing benefit rules, they will no longer qualify for housing benefit for a single room flat because they're under 25 and they only get the single room rate. But because they're in a supported accommodation, not only have they got that extra expense, but they've got the extra expense of running of living in somewhere that's got on-site support.
This matters. You know, the definitions of what exactly we're talking about really matter. And there's a group of accommodation, and the hostels I was describing is one of them. And you know, there's quite a few, and those are the ones we want to exclude at this time from the traditional, the housing element, because the costs in those hostels can be very, very much higher, because there's all kinds of security and support being offered, which Universal Credit isn't best placed to deal with. And you can see the direction of travel I was describing a bit earlier, with the localization of some of this support for the people who really know how it's best applied. It's much better going in that direction than into a kind of a national system. Which can't.
Sorry, I mean,
this is the. Can I just remind everybody that this is defined in DWP legislation already for the supported exempt accommodation. It's a very clear definition, and it's that which we are talking about here. So, in answer to Jackson, who defines it? It's defined in legislation. So, I mean, I can read it out if the committee wants to.
But will the individual providers then of this? Do they know who they are?
So for those, we're looking through discretionary payments and also through an option to pay direct in response to their concern that they would have a problem if it was through UC. So
those providers already know who they are and know that they will have that protection.
Yeah, we're talking to the a variety of groups. I think.
I don't think the individuals know yet.
I mean, I think this is news. I mean, I think we are telling you something that has not been broadcast. That we have decided to go down a rather different route for the supported exempt accommodation in response to the real concerns that we heard when we put out the draft.
So could I clarify something here? The list of supported exempt housing is already out there in the public sector as published by the DWP. What you are now telling us is that they will be exempted from the limitations with regard to housing benefit that will apply to everybody else under universal credit.
Yes.
What I mean is the tenants of those exempt supported accommodations.
Yes. What will happen is that they will claim universal credit without a housing element, because the housing element will be supplied through a different route, because we're talking about a very different cost base for those very vulnerable people.
For a particular, maybe short period of time, but they are defined very clearly. The accommodation is defined clearly, and groups like Women's Aid, Homeless Link, Refuge, MedCap, they've all made this clear. Those are the kind of groups that are concerned about this. So we said we'd go away, look at this, and see how we do. This is basically what our
You've now made the announcement today.
I didn't know we'd made this announcement.
But you did say that you estimate that people are only there for 3 months. That certainly isn't my experience.
He was using it as an illustration, I think.
Well, it can. No, what I'm saying.
It's a very rosy illustration.
Well, illustration about the temporary nature of the accommodation. That's why it's called.
Yeah, but temporary can spread out for quite a considerable period of time.
Yes,
but an example is refuge.
Yeah, they've all made representations. Good common sense stuff. They've talked to us about it. This is what the consultation on all these things is about. We look to see how we would do that. We discuss it. Lord Freud's been discussing it. And that's where we decided actually on this that may be necessary on those two categories, either using DHPs or maybe through direct payment to the providers. One way or the other, that will be how it will be. And as Lord Freud says, then without the housing element inside universal.
And does that cost all come out of your budget?
Yes, I mean what will happen is that we have a certain amount of budget for these groups currently, and it's just a question of how that money flows through. Yeah. So this is not a cost-cutting measure. This is about making sure this money flows through in a way that does not undermine a sector which is really important for some people who are in real extremes. So we really want to make sure that...
Can I say there's one stage further too, because in the short term looking at taking this through, and then in the longer term developing a much more localised, basically a kind of localised funding system that draws more on local knowledge and makes it much more responsive. And that's essentially where, in the longer term, we're looking to go with this system. So it's not a temporary measure, we want to develop that into a system that actually works to the benefit of those who find themselves in these difficult circumstances.
But not dependent on local authority budgets?
No, this is about local knowledge, not local budgets.
Fine.
This is using local knowledge. And, like Social Fund was simply saying, look, we do believe that when you get, local knowledge, you will make a much better decision about these things, and probably quicker too.
Well, with respect, that was a rather unfortunate choice, because the social fund is reduced by 10% and it's no longer ring-fenced.
But actually, we think that the decisions around the social fund, with respect to Jackson, will be made better by that localisation, because now you will not continue to pay people through the social fund, when in actual fact you should be working to help sort their problems out, not just keep giving them extra elements from the social fund without actually knowing why they're in that situation. So, with respect, I think we'll find...
I don't disagree with the premise. I'd just be interested to see if these loaves and fishes actually feed.
I think we might move on from how we
could we just ask the one about the next one? Paying housing costs direct. To tenants.
I think in your reply to me at the very beginning, you said that there will be provision to pay housing costs direct to landlords.
We've always said that what we do is we make a system for the majority, we then look at what the problems are for the minority, and we said all along we need to look very carefully at the trigger points that actually mean someone's simply not coping, and temporarily you may need to take that in hand, as it were, but at the same time you want to get them back out of that and deal with their problems.
Local authorities and housing associations are really, really concerned about it.
I know, and we are talking to them about that.
I'll take Teresa in very quickly on that.
Just quickly, housing benefit will transfer to universal credit. Currently there's 20,000 housing benefit officers employed by local authorities. Those duties will transfer to universal credit, but those individuals won't be TUPE'd, so I believe.
That's right.
I think the DWP wrote to the local government association saying that it's not a TUPE transfer, but local authorities are stuck in the situation of having to negotiate with these employees without being the decision maker. Would the DWP not negotiate with the representatives of these employees?
Well, this is what we're looking at is a system which is moving quite a lot of responsibilities locally, and we started to describe some of those. Councils, and we're talking to local authorities a lot in this area, are looking at how to provide services on a much more holistic basis. So over the next couple of years, there will be a reorganisation of service for the most vulnerable families, and it may be that some of the people who are doing housing now start to do a rather different and a broader role. And one of the things we're looking at clearly is in the local authority pilots is how they may act as intermediaries into the universal credit system. I think what we're saying, things are certainly going to change. How they change is something that we will be developing
Can I just pick up something on that? That's quite important. Two things are very important. Remember, this is not October Big Bang. This is a 4-year development process with different benefits coming through. So this is a 4-year process by which essentially local authorities have time to make some of those changes. The second point important to make, I think, with respect to the local authorities, is that there are also 3 other areas that they're now having to take on. So local authorities themselves, with budgets that follow, are actually doing, for example, council tax benefit, social fund, discretionary housing payments have got to be done, which they weren't doing before. So my point about this is that it's not just saying there's a group that are not doing this anymore, but there's also requirements that local governments having to do, which, you know, they will need to look at the resource that's there and decide to what degree do they need to take some of that resource on, and that is over a period of time. So I think that there's plenty of time to resolve that.
So for local authorities who directly employ their housing benefits staff, that might be more simple than for local authorities that actually contract that out and would have to renegotiate contracts. That would be more difficult. What support will you be giving to local authorities if they have to make people redundant, for instance? Will there be any recompense to them, or will the DWP underwrite that?
So, I mean, you've jumped from you've jumped from the contracted out into their own staff. I mean, the contracted out, clearly there's a time process.
They'll have to renegotiate those contracts.
Yeah, and the speed and pace and the notice we're giving allows gives them time to do that. When we come to their own staff, as Ian said, there are quite a lot of roles being developed, so there are new things to be done, and as the local authorities reorganise themselves and look at those roles, it may very well be that there's a kind of a circulation of people into new roles. Some of the skills of the people in housing are very valuable elsewhere in the rest of Universal Credit, and that is what these pilots, one of the things these pilots are about.
So would the DWP be prepared to share the legal advice they got saying it wasn't a TUPE with local authorities?
I'm not inclined to share that advice. It's a matter for us to discuss with local authorities, with respect, I think, and it's for local authorities to resolve this matter themselves. My sense about this is, to be honest with you, I think that this is a matter which is being made much bigger than it is. The reality is local authorities, contracted out or with their own, have time to deal with this, and basically we never do share that information, and I don't think it's necessary this time.
Okay.
Can I just very quickly ask why it is that you're withdrawing mortgage interest support from claimants from when they start work immediately, even if it's only for a few hours, whereas if they were in rented accommodation, they would still qualify for universal benefit?
I mean, this was actually quite a tough area. We've been looking very closely at support for mortgage interest, which, as you know, has been was inflated, that support as what was meant to be a temporary response to the 2008 crash. In our consultation paper, which came out last year, I think, we looked at having a mechanism not of giving grants of, which is what it is at the moment, but having them as effectively as loans, which would come back later, potentially when people die and then have to and their home is disposed of. So that is the kind of consultation that we've been looking at. So we clearly need to think very hard at where is support for mortgage interest going. On the specific, and that is our direction of travel.
But the thing is,
I'm coming to the short term.
If it's withdrawn as soon as they go into work, all the things that you've trumpeted about how universal credit will work for people in mini jobs or micro jobs. There's somebody who's got a mortgage is not going to take a part-time job.
I don't agree with that.
Because
I really don't agree with that.
Let me take on that. I gave you the outline of our direction of travel on this, which kind of leads you to some shorter-term decisions. One of the key fact is very, very few people with mortgages work part-time. It's a very
less
small...
Than 5%.
Yeah, 5%.
Less,
thank you.
5%.
Less. It's a very small number. If we were to structure the mortgage payments in a similar way to rental ones on the taper, we would be looking at an enormous cost, an unaffordable cost, for something that is frankly not the direction of travel that we're looking at longer term. And the cutover point depends on exactly the level of disregards, but by the time people earn income of have done 7 hours on the minimum income level, they're matching the existing system if they're on the average mortgage support.
And 10 hours means they'll be better off.
And they're better off at 10 hours.
Yeah.
So that is where our decision, it was bluntly unaffordable to make it generic for everyone. And the numbers of people affected were very small, and their response to do 7, 10, 12 hours took them out of the problem, and that's why we reached that decision.
There are people who pay mortgage on a house, which, for example, they've turned into 2 flats. They live in one and they rent the other. If they lose that, then their tenant, who has paid their rent regularly, is going to lose their home.
Yes, well, we don't think they will, with respect, and it's the point that Lord Freud is making here quite categorically, that it's a very small number that we're talking about, but nonetheless, you know, in this category, that amount of hours that has to be worked, even under the present system, would bring them to parity. It's very small, and under the present existing disregard process, they'd be very quickly in a better situation. We think at around about 10 hours at the moment of work, which, to be fair, if you look at 7 hours over the week, that's not, you know, it's not a huge amount. In fact, that's really quite a small amount under the present system. They'll be better off than that. So.
Okay, can we move on to another section on the claimants?
We're on to reduced entitlements and passported benefits. And passported benefits, one of the most popular, the one particularly valued actually, is free school meals. How do you plan to deal with the eligibility criteria for free school meals when you introduce UC next year?
Well, the initial strategy is to try and leave this as unchanged as possible. So what we're aiming to do is supply adequate information to the other government departments to allow them to run the system as they want to do it. And we're in active discussions on that data share. And the aim will be to have a system out for next October, when the universal credit goes national. Before that, on pilots, because the numbers are relatively small, we'll probably allow. We're looking to allow effectively everyone on universal credit who has children in school would be able to get the passport benefit, but the numbers are going to be extraordinarily small, because our design in that passporting period is to typically take single people pretty near the job market as we trial it. So basically there will be enough information on earnings to allow the Department for Education to actually reach a decision on where it wants to place any passporting concessions.
Well, you referred to single parents in your response, and the evidence that was presented to us by the CAB was that a lone parent with 3 school-aged children, the value of free school meals could be around £1,100 a year. And what they were arguing is that to maintain that, you would have to earn 4 times to be able to maintain that level of providing your children with free school meals. So are you saying to us that these interim arrangements are only interim arrangements, and when the massive number of people who are under universal credit, you will look again at what constitutes eligibility for free school meals? Okay.
Let me. So to start with, we will provide enough information to allow the department to run the system so that basically a similar number and category of people will go on receiving the passported benefits. If you're now asking...
Sorry, I don't understand that. What do you mean, a similar number of people? I mean, if there's an eligibility criteria, that is a criteria. What is the criteria?
Well, the criteria at the moment is receiving benefits.
Yes.
Of a particular benefit. You receive JSA. The JSA amount is £64 or whatever the precise figure is. So what we need to do is provide the right level of what the universal credit payment is to define the current point at which people receive these benefits. So basically, the strategy is to run the system on as closely as possible as the existing system. Now, the problem that you are concerned about, and I'm sure all members of this committee are concerned about, are the cliff edge problems of as you go earn more money and you drop off the eligibility, you lose your £1,100, and that is a disincentive to go to work. And that is the problem that everyone is concerned about with passported benefits. And we conducted an exercise last year where SAC looked at this issue very closely and provided us with some advice to which we responded. And one of the most interesting pieces, recommendations to come out of that report was that we should look at incorporating these passported benefits into the universal credit itself, so that people who took school meals were paid for them in the universal credit, paid them out again to the school, for instance, and then they got tapered away as their universal credit is tapered away, and that gets rid of the cliff edge, and we could look at doing that in a way that meant there was no cash out of anyone's pocket. We can do it, payment in advance, if you like, or almost notional. Now, that is something that we wrote that we would explore providing a generic passporting services for other government departments to allow them to have a very efficient and attractive way of provided passported benefits. So that is the would be the strategic longer term solution as we look forward to a fully rolled out universal credit.
So in the interim period, you don't perceive any family losing their passported school meals benefit?
Well, clearly I cannot make a commitment of what another department decides to do, but we will provide information to allow them to run on the kind of existing level of support based on the level of concession that they currently look to apply.
So is one of those departments can I just finish this? Is one of those departments you're talking to the Department of Education, because free school meals are linked to pupil premiums. So when they go, are some of the most deprived schools in our country going to lose money?
With respect, they've got legislation at the moment. They have got to decide what they want to do with that. What Lord Freud is saying, as these are already vested in different departments as their own policy, they are not DWP policy, nor are they essentially within that remit of the means tested benefits that we were talking about. They're separate to that. What we're saying to them is, okay, these are the things that we can do within universal credit. You have to decide whether that's what you want or whether you would want to do this differently to maintain those passported benefits. And that's a discussion that we have with them going forward.
But it is obviously crucial, Secretary of State, because the very group that we're trying, or universal credit trying so hard to break, are the very group that we believe, the coalition government, the pupil premium will help us break. So
agreed. My point is not that, but I'm not here to answer the question of how the Education Department resolves their issues in that respect. What I need from them, and what we're in discussion with them about, is how they therefore wish to see that interact with universal credit. They may actually decide they don't want to see it interact with universal credit. They'd rather dispose of that locally on a set of criteria that maintains exactly the same people on that benefit. You know, and that may be a possible solution for them. All I'm simply saying is, from our standpoint, we are available to do that, but they, you know, the individual departments. And we talk endlessly about free school meals, but as this committee will know, the nature of the numbers of passported benefits, and they're all differently hooked. So they have to make that decision in each of the departments. They have different trigger points. They're not all the same. They're quite different. Some are incredibly complex about the way they want to run, and some of those departments may say, actually, we find it much easier to control those separately. If you ask me about universal credit, it has no bearing in the sense that it makes it better or less good for universal credit. For us, it's an issue that says we can do these certain things, but these will be the criteria that we have to set for that. But you need to decide whether you want to do it like that or you want to maintain it in much the same way, in which case, you know, we can go on without it. It's not. It doesn't have a bearing on universal credit being successful.
But universal credit it's virtually impossible to identify the triggers that used to put in payment a passported benefit.
Well, you know, when I look through the list of passported benefits, some of them are unbelievably complex, as we know, and have a whole variety of different triggers that get you to that point, and some of them are to do with the benefit system and some of them are with the benefit system. So my point is really what we're trying to offer is that it affects the benefit system within universal credit. We can arrange for that, but they have to decide whether they want to do it like that.
I think the fear is that there'll be all sorts of different assessments in order to decide who is going to qualify for this money.
But with respect,
if you're in receipt of that benefit.
Chairman, as I look through it now, categorically, there are already a complex range of assessments. That is the one thing I would say, outside of our remit, is incredibly complex, being built up over a period of time. Actually, it seems like half the people involved in it don't understand it, and certainly those in receipt of it have great.
Can I just make a request to the committee? If this committee was to look through that particular proposition of actually putting it on universal credit coherently along the SAC lines and recommend that we pursue that with all speed in the years to come, I think Secretary of State and I would be most appreciative.
So you're saying that your mind isn't made up, but you come up with a potential solution.
Well, we're discussing it with everybody to find out whether it matches their needs. But as I say, some of these are so complex and were set for different reasons, and some of them aren't even hinged on, triggers in benefits elsewhere. So my point is that, not all of them are the same. Free school meals is argue perhaps one of the simpler ones, but the rest are actually progressively complex. And then, of course, there's the Welsh devolved administrations issue around theirs as well, whereas, the education department doesn't cover into these areas, so there are those complexities alongside. So we're in discussion with all of them about this and the best way to do it, frankly.
But could I just clarify? So you're saying, are you, that the majority of passported benefits do not come out of the DWP? They are the responsibility of other departments?
Well, yes, that is exactly the reason they're called passported. They are basically.
What I'm trying to clarify here is, if that is the case, then surely that list of passported benefits should be very easy to define and hand it over to other people. Wouldn't that make your life easier? It'd make much, much harder for claimants.
Can I just answer that question by saying we are flexible to either do one, if that is how people wish to take their payments forward on a set criteria, then that's fine. What we're saying is, if you wish to have it on the basis of being brought through and triggered through universal credit, then we have an idea of, we discussed how to do it, and it's up to the departments now to decide that.
But your pathfinder starts in April next year.
Yes, but as
there'll be people on GSA initially. There will be people with children down the line who might have.
Everyone in the pathfinder is covered. Because that's not an issue.
Sorry, why are they covered?
Because we won't have a system ready until the formal start. So the numbers are very few, and we have decided, in the interest of not causing any problems as we run the pathfinder, just to say people on universal credit would have the same passported rights as they would if they were on the benefit system. So we just kind of run. So just for that 6 months.
That's not an issue.
I don't understand any of that.
You could say it's an opportunity to look at this again if the department want to look at how they want to do it. That's something that's being built up over time, become very complex, and I think maybe a good opportunity for them to do this.
The way you're talking, it looks like the grandfather rights, or whatever you're calling it, might actually go on for some time.
No. I mean, look, this is up to the departments in terms of their budgets, but we will provide them the data to allow them to run effectively, run on more or less, without too much change. The same eligibility as the existing position, because our interest clearly is not to cause any problems or changes on an interim basis when there is potentially a strategic solution looking a couple of years ahead, which actually makes much more sense for everyone and could be a very attractive solution, and certainly the SAC recommended solution.
We also had evidence that specific groups of disabled people will have a significantly lower income on universal credit than under the current system, even when they're not fit for work. What's the policy rationale behind this?
It's just not true.
Oh, good. Fill us in then.
If the severe disablement premium goes, it is.
Well, we have maintained the amount of spending within the disabled community. We've adjusted how it's distributed. Clearly, there's transitional protection for those where there is a change. The particular change you may be looking at is the simplification of the child premiums.
Which has been reduced, hasn't it, from 57
it's
down
down
to
from
28.
3 levels to 2 levels. We spent an enormous amount of time debating this, and one of the commitments that I made, what emerged was there was a sense of unease about the definitions of which children fitted in which category. So we've made a commitment to have a hard look at that within the next 3 years, just to make sure that we have got disabled children defined appropriately. So that is something that we will do. And the numbers going into universal credit
I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt you there, but you're saying the definition of disabled children. If we're looking at the government's policy here, it is to enable people to get back to work. And that won't be the child, it will be the parent.
Yes.
Now, for some parents, that is absolutely impossible because of the disability of their child or children. Yes. There are others who could get back to work even though their child is disabled. So that's the issue, isn't it? Not the definition of the disability.
Yeah, no.
Of the child.
The only change that people are concerned about is the reduction in the three. In the levels of the disabled children. So what we've done is matched up.
I'm sorry, it's much wider than that. The severe disabled premium of £58, there is no equivalent in the universal credit, and that was specifically very separate from disability living allowance. That was helped to reflect the extra costs of a disabled person who lived alone, who would have to buy in care because they wouldn't have live-in care. That goes, and there's nothing to replace that. The disabled child edition comes down from 57 a week to 28 per week, pound per week, and so again there's less money going there. There's no equivalent of the disability element of the working tax credit for those who are found fit for work. These they don't qualify. I was going to ask a question on what the eligibility for the higher disregard will be for those with a disability, what happens to people who are presently on permitted work. So, those are examples where what's presently in the benefit system, and that's not. There's also the one where you can be both a recipient and a carer, and both in the couple can, and only one will be able in the couple. So you can define it differently, but there will be less money going into those households, whatever way you
well, can I just? We could end up arguing forever on this. Can I just make one point, though, about the disabled and what universal credit does for them? Because I think universal credit is the most liberating thing for the disabled community that there is. Because at the moment, if you are defined as disabled, that's it, you are stuck. You cannot trial going into work. You can get the certain amount of money, and then that's it. You lose it. Under the universal credit, once you have been placed in the particular position by the work capability assessment, you will be able to try and do some work, and you'll be able to work as much as you can, which may fluctuate. So the present position is, if you were to try and work and you were disabled on the benefit system, you would get off the benefit system and go into the tax credit system, fearful the whole time that whatever problem you had might reoccur 2, 3, 4 months later. And clearly, then you would have to get off tax credits and get back into the benefit system. And as everyone knows, complete nightmare. I remember when I was looking at this a few years ago, I was given the shocking figure that if you've got a reasonably complicated claim, your paperwork was lost 40% of the time. Yeah. So basically, people don't take that kind of risk. No one would take that kind of risk. With universal credit, you've got a fluctuating condition. You can work full time for those months when you can, and then when it's bad, you can go back into part-time or none for a period, and back and forth. You are liberated by the system in a way that the present categorizations simply don't allow. So I think this is one of the most liberating things for people who have a disability. And don't forget, people who the number of people who are who are disabled from mental health reasons is 42% of the total, and it rises after a couple of years of inactivity to 68%. Those are figures that I remember. So we are doing something more for people in this category with universal credit than has been done before, and I really think that is a liberating factor.
I know that Baroness Tannegrey-Thompson's undertaking a report which will come out, we think, in October into all of this. But I think you've got a very, shall we say, naive. I was trying to avoid saying naive, but I think you've got a rather naive view of how disabled people, or many disabled people, or people with long-term health conditions, live their lives. Absolutely. And to get the severe disability premium, they needed care. That was specifically for care. So we're talking about a group of people that actually have quite high needs, and that in that case they won't get their severe disablement premium. Now, we understand from other evidence there might be winners and losers in all of this, but there will be families or households that will lose out as a result of these changes, particularly in the removal of the disability premiums.
Well, what we would find...
Before we begin, can I just ask one practical point, which has nothing to do with the questioning, but I'm wondering what time you plan to go on to.
Well, I know.
Because I've got meetings I'd planned, I'll get them changed if necessary, but I wondered what...
Well, we've got this section, one more section, so hopefully 15-20 minutes, if that's all right with you.
Okay, if I could just make that clear. Put people back in 15 minutes.
But can we deal with that very important...
With progress with implementation.
Dave and Beck was pointing out, because I actually not only accept the narrative of what you're saying, I agree with it, and one of the reasons about the politics, but underpinning that, I do have that fear of, for instance, and some of these were actually from groups like the CAB, you know, the disabled child edition has been reduced from 57 to £28 per week, unless the child is receiving higher rate care under DLA. There is no equivalent to the severe disability premium of £58 per week in university credit. So how do we manage those profound anxieties for people, mostly with quite significant disabilities, who, as far as they can see, crumbs, I'm going to lose 50, 60 quid a week. Do you see?
Well, I mean, what we're doing is raising this money is maintained in the disabled community. We're not taking money out here.
So if there are winners, then there's bound to be losers then?
Yes, we are. Well, there are losers in the structure of it, but of course the Transitional Protection Society, there's no actual cash losers.
What you're saying, if I'm a disabled person hypothetically losing £57 per week down to 28. What you're saying is the way universal credit is working is that £30, for the sake of argument, will be actually made up in different ways within universal credit.
Yeah, because it's going into a higher payment for the disabled adults, the severely disabled adults, at £77.
Our rate is quite a significant increase. And the point about that is that, I mean, if I just listen, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 variable payments, all coming off different benefits. And bear in mind that we also have DLA and ESA outside of this. And the point is, what's happened piecemeal? I mean, these disability benefits, some of them existed before DLA came in. And in actual fact, none of this was really reconciled. And our point about this is what we're saying is all the money that goes into this is being recycled into the same support for disabled people. But a lot of what we've looked at says that within this system, the group that going back to work need, the biggest support was the most severely disabled. And that increase, we think, enormously will help them through into work. And that's the point about universal credit, and for those while they're seeking work. As I said, there are other benefits around this that are DLA, which is out with the support for disabled people within the universal credit, and ESA, which gets bound into this. My point about this, when you look at it, is that this is money we are putting in with the balance to both simplify, get rid of the cliff edge for young people as they come into adulthood, which has been one of the problems that I know has caused issues, and actually to go to a higher settlement for those that are most disabled. And I think that is our purpose: cash protection on the transitional protection, so that we don't see a big sudden fallout, but overall managing this so it makes it easier for people with greater disabilities to be sustained.
But
DLA is out with universal credit, that's what I'm talking
about.
Will there be any caps on the cash protection? In other words, if a household is losing £100 a week, or even £150 a week as a result of the changes, will they get the full cash protection for that? Until change of circumstances or
absolutely.
Or
and we will work, this identified group, the point is, identified working very closely with them to ensure that actually in the cases that are necessary, that they are, maybe some of them should actually and aren't in receipt of DLA. And my point is, this is such a complex issue. A lot of the people, I know there are differences of opinion, but a lot of people don't understand what they should and shouldn't be getting. It's got so complex. Really, when I looked at this list, I just thought, this is built up piecemeal over a period of time, and no one sat down and said, how do we simplify this so we help people?
I don't think anybody disagrees with you. It's very complex. I think their problem is that even the universal credit is going to be quite complex as well. That's the difficulty of
we think
and why other people
simpler
haven't
than
done
the
it.
present system.
You've been brave enough to put yourself forward, and you're doing it. But it's where other politicians have feared to tread, perhaps.
Well, the fundamental point is we are reorganising disability payments to make them coherent, but we're not taking any money away.
Absolutely not.
Even without transitional protection, we're not taking any money away in the restructure, and then we're making sure that people are cash protected to transitional protection, who are used to particular payments, and then the new structure comes in, which is more coherent. The thing that has particularly warped the system is because of the child poverty agenda over the last decade, child payments have been rising and rising relative to adult payments, and we have got this, and that's what's been driving up the overall disability, child disability payments. And one of the reasons to get it back into line is to make an adjustment to get the system to be coherent to that. But it's not sensible to have a payment running for children which drops immediately they hit adulthood, and they're still living at home in practice in many cases.
There's no reduction in the payment. You mean for the whole of universal credit when it actually rolls out?
Yes.
That there's going to be no reduction, no one is going to lose out. I'd like to know then how you're going to make the reductions in your departmental budget. You've got to cut billions.
No, we're not cutting the money. The disability payments that we
I was referring to
are
the
in there, and the transitional protection is already budgeted within our scope. It's got nothing to do with what we're doing in other benefit areas. Under universal credit, this area of disability is the same going through to universal credit and protected for those who are in through the transitional protection. It's in the budget.
You're still going to make the billions of cuts in your department.
You know, what we're already down to do at the moment is separate to this universal credit.
I think that we're going to have to write you with some questions, but Andrew has been waiting patiently all through, and
right.
He's got at least one question, if not two.
Okay. Just really about the implementation. The draft regulations you published in June, SAC have commented back. When will the final detailed ones be laid before Parliament?
Well, we will lay the final regs after the autumn statement now, because we have
the autumn statement.
Yes.
The autumn statement, yeah. Which is December
the 5th, I think. 5th, so we will, and the reason for that is we've got to put all the rates out, and that is, and the autumn statement
has a bearing.
Which will see at the same time when you present the earnings disregard figures. So
exactly. The whole thing wraps up, as the Secretary of State said, there's a debate with the OBR, the Treasury, autumn statement, and the structure of our regulations.
Good. Okay, I'm quite reassured of what we've heard today on various levels, but it is such a huge revolutionary change. Where do you think the three biggest risk areas are still?
Well, I'll say what I think the challenges are that we need to get right, and we've been spending a lot of energy and effort on. And that is to get the security system working properly, and that is at several levels. That's around identity, making sure that the people who go in are the people that they say they are, and clearly there's a lot of cleaning up we can do with the existing base, and cyber fraud, just to make sure the system is utterly robust. It's got a lot of energy and effort into making sure of that, and to make sure that we have got an operational capability of watching what's happening to the system, and we're introducing JSOC, a Joint Operations capability there. So we sit and watch the system and see what's happening as it runs. We're going to identity assurance. We're going to go out to the marketplace to make sure to open up a marketplace to make sure that people's identities are verified by externals and we take them through. So that's a new thing, and we're introducing cyber fraud, some of the most sophisticated systems adapted from the banks and others, to make sure that we have a really robust system. So those are that's the some of the biggest.
The online cyber fraud are the area that is probably in all of this the newest, I guess, really, because it's not historically something that the systems have got in, but a lot of other people have gone before. So we've been in discussions with companies like Amazon, for example, who actually have a very good record on this, and also talked to other government organisations who are specifically involved in this, and I shan't necessarily name them. But my point is that so we are working closely with them. Bear in mind that there are states that wish to attack things, and there are criminals out there who do a lot of online attacks and fraud. So it's making sure we've got the systems that don't. You can have a very secure system, and the secure system is the one that you shut down and nobody can get into it. Yeah. So clearly we have to have a system that has a variety of different checks. If somebody goes through, their data is held, and we can use it, but nobody else can, and so it goes on. So those are the things that companies that say like Amazon have had to do, and very successfully over the years, and it's learning from what they do, because this essentially is a consumer product, just like theirs, but it has a particularly important feature, which is that we cannot and must always be ready for the moments when we have to pay people at all times, because not paying them can cause some problems. So.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we've got to get that reassurance across to people, because people will be nervous about it. Because
it's an area certainly that I think, if you don't mind me saying, as the chairman of the committee might want to look at in general terms, because it's an area that's least understood, I think, sometimes by our colleagues in the House, about how cyber fraud and fraud has moved on dramatically since the early days.
Picking up on what and my colleague said on getting that news out to the public, I think one of the biggest challenges that you face is that because the media dialogue, for the want of a better word, has I'm being a bit subjective here, but being so hyperbolic over the last few months, I think that one of your challenges is to ensure the people who you believe, and I share that belief, will actually benefit from universal credit, get back to thinking that this is a good thing.
Yes.
So, I mean, what would you have to...
Well, perhaps I can reassure you, Mr. Lloyd, about this, and to say that on Thursday we are carrying out a major exercise in informing the media about what we're doing, in the same kind of detail as we're talking to you, looking at the system at the front end, talking about the budgets, talking about all the elements that you've, as a committee, want to inquire into. We're going to take them through that, show them that essentially we're going to open up much more to external view and scrutiny, because I think that we'll benefit from it, and also this is such an important system that I want people to learn what it's all about. And there's a lot of ignorance at the moment in the media, and some suppositions made about things which I think are important to tackle head on. And the most important one is this, everyone says you mustn't have a big bang, you mustn't go straight off, you're not going to be ready on time. The truth is, the time that we deliver this is 2017, when it's complete and it's in. So that's over 4 years. We start that process in October. We don't finish it. It just begins. And the whole point about the agile process, which I find it frustrating at times because we can't get across to people, is to understand that agile is about change. It's about allowing you to get to a certain point in the process, one leap, check it out, make sure it works. As you go into the next leap, you come up with something that actually says, we can rectify some of the issues in this, make that even more efficient. So you're constantly rolling forward, improving and making more efficient things. So there's a constant retrospective change that goes on to complete that system, and that's what will happen all through those 4 years.
And some of the announcements that you've made today have actually assuaged some particular fears that I think some of us have actually had. So, I mean,
and you'll see more of that now, because what we're saying, we're at the stage now where the system itself is getting to the point where we understand critically where that is, and we know now, therefore, where the trade-offs are with the concerns that have come to us and how we can deal with them.
I mean, I think one of the biggest opportunities, everyone concentrates on building the machine, if you like. What's really interesting is the ecosystem around it. And we've talked a bit about the opportunities here, and the opportunities are incredible to transform people's lives with the digital inclusion and the financial inclusion. So those are two things, as you could hear we're looking at today, those are two things which we think will make more social transformation in terms of improving people's lives if we can get it right, and we're concentrating on it and we're working on it to make it right. We could really improve people's lives and lift what they do. So that is our objective here, based on the introduction of the universal credit.
I think you're right, because the way online digital has transformed people's lives in other areas now comes to this. So I think you're dealing with people fearful of change and fearful of moving onto the internet with things, and I think that's absolutely right. Okay.
But it's part of our role to make sure that you make it work, is for us to scrutinise and to be as hard as we can on you to make sure, because the thought, if it doesn't work, that's somewhere where I don't think we would like to go. So can I thank you both very much for coming along. It was a longer session than we intended. It's dark outside, but I do appreciate your time. Obviously, we've still got some questions we didn't ask. I hope we can write to you and get some answers for some of the more detailed stuff, particularly. But certainly, we will probably at some time in the future be revisiting this. But in the meantime, you've given us enough to start writing our report. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Michelle.
Order. Meeting is now adjourned.
Thank you.